Okay.
Okay, we are good to go.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, dear friends. I welcome you all today on ECPM's event on European economic cooperation during the corona crisis and maybe some ideas how we can get out of this crisis. Today we have two analysts with us, Dr. Alleen Westerhof. She is the founder and executive director of the Economic Summit. This is an organization that helps businesses to transform sustainably through mutual value creation, a relational view of society, and paradigms based on Christian tradition, faith and thought. The guiding principle for this new paradigm is that she proposes is the so-called economics of mutuality. That is a way of thinking first set out by the Mars Corporation. And Arlene is also director of the Center for Economics and Mutuality, a collaboration between the Economic Summit organization, the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and some members of the Dutch Parliament. And it opened very recently on the 9th of March 2020. And I'm sure that we'll speak a bit more on the economics of mutuality later on and how this could help the EU to emerge from the current health and economic crisis. So very welcome, Arlene.
It's good to be with you, Jacques.
Thank you. Also a warm welcome to Professor Dr. Florin Duma from the Babas Bolyai University in Cluj in Romania. Florin lectures and researches in the area of public finance. He has a lot of international experience in both lecturing and training of students and politicians in matters of effectively spending public means for the greater benefit of society. At least that's how I know you. Florin has a large experience in consultancy of both the private and public sector. Very welcome to you as well, Florin. Unfortunately, we can't see you, but we know that you're with us.
I hope you can hear me. Nice to meet you, Jacques, again, and nice to meet you, Arlene.
Good to meet you too, Florian.
I hope you hear me right, or too loud?
Yes, loud and clear, Florin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Also, and as for me, I will be your moderator during this session. My name is Jack Bazen. I am lecturer international economics in international economics at Saxion University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands and a board member of ECPM. Unfortunately, because this is not a live stream, we will not have the possibility to directly answer questions, but we'll try to see if we can do something with that afterwards. To start our conversation, I would like to discuss with our speakers today about their analysis of the current corona crisis and how European cooperation so far went to try to alleviate this crisis or the consequences of this crisis. I think it is now a good moment to look back on all the negotiations on the EU level that have been there in the last months. Those negotiations that led to a 500 billion euro support package and guarantees and loans and whatsoever for some of the most affected member states. We heard some serious remarks during these negotiations from the President of France, for example, also one of those hard-hit countries, that these outcomes of these negotiations might even say something about the future of the European Union. So my question maybe to you first, Arlene, what is your evaluation on the way the support measures were negotiated and agreed upon?
Well, let's put it like this, and I'm going to turn down my volume just to make sure you don't get reverberation. Is the sound all right, Jacques?
Sound is perfect, thank you.
Okay. Well, let's just put it like this. I'm going to start, first of all, not so much with the negotiations as with my appraisal of the situation, and then work through to the negotiations. And I'll try and keep it succinct. I needed to think in preparing for this about a conversation that I had with someone who worked at the European Central Bank a few years ago. And this person told me that what 2 world wars faced or failed to do, and that was to end society as we know it, This, or at least the crisis in 2008 almost did. That was the financial crisis. This crisis, however, with Corona is far worse and far more far-reaching in impact than the financial crisis of 2008. Prognosis is indeed that all of our GDPs are expected to fall globally, but also within Europe. Netherlands, we expect a 4 to 9% fall of GDP. The United Kingdom, they've already had Brexit, but 15 to 20%. That's massive. For comparison, for example, also the GDP of the United States is expected to fall by 24%, almost a quarter of its GDP. That means that all of our standards of living are going to be negatively affected. And geopolitically, what we see within Europe is that we're grappling with things, but I think it's important in this discussion also not to lose sight of the fact that China is busy with a new Marshall Plan, and they're trying to get into Europe. They're getting into Europe through Italy. They're using Italy as a bridgehead because, of course, it's being very, very hard hit, Italy and Spain. And indeed, there's a big expectation of a crisis of the euro. But I find in the negotiations, etc., I heard an interview with Emmanuel Macron on CNN, and I know that Emmanuel Macron is speaking about the EU, the Eurozone, as a political union. And I found it very, very insightful that there was much criticism here in the Netherlands on his analysis of the situation. Why? Because France and some nations are viewing it as a political union, but Netherlands and the Hanseatic Union within the EU are viewing it as a trade union. And so the paradigms and the assumptions that we're already beginning with are vastly different within the Eurozone. I'll stop there for now.
Yep, thank you. That is indeed quite an issue, I would say, to have these different paradigms, and that may lead to very different negotiation processes and outcomes. From an Eastern European perspective, though, it would also be interesting to hear something. So when I turn to you, Florin, we have not heard too much about the countries from Eastern Europe during this COVID-19 crisis, but I assume they're also rather hard hit economically speaking, also facing quite some decreases in GDP, as Arlene just commented upon. Would you be so kind as to negotiate, as to comment on the negotiations, and also to tell us something about the effects that you can see in Central and Eastern European countries?
Yes. Well, it is a fact that actually we are living in extraordinary times. It's truly a black swan what happened. I mean, all of us were thinking that the crisis is around the corner since 2 or 3 or maybe 4 years, some of us, but we didn't know how we look like, and apparently it's worse that we ever imagined. And well, first I will try to give you a perspective on the Romanian economy and on the economies on the Eastern Europe. Of course, we expect, unfortunately, same level of GDP decrease, somewhere between 10 to 15%. But what it's worse here, it's that we had the deficits, especially the fiscal deficits, which was already last year 4%, and for this year the European Commission last forecast was for 10%, just the fiscal deficit, which is absolutely unsustainable. And plus, we have the so-called twin deficits. We have a problem with the current account deficit, which is a real trouble. So beside the decrease in the GDP, we have these imbalances in these two deficits, which are hurting the economy, and we don't know what will be the outcome at the end of this. Going back to the negotiation, I mean, the impression here in Eastern Europe was that EU, I mean, the European Commission reacted quite slow to this crisis, and especially reacted quite slow in trying to help those countries who were hit the first, like Italy, for instance. We had the impression that EU was a spectator, more or less, if I can say so, to what happened to Italy and then to Spain, and this opened the door for China, as Erlene said, but also for Russia at some point. Even a country like Cuba, if you remember, they sent some people in Italy, some doctors, or which was unbelievable, at least for me. Well, things started to change slowly, but I think we can talk later on about this. I will stop here for now, but.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. Do you see or do you from Romania have this impression that this crisis was used as a sort of geopolitical instrument, at least in the beginning, by Russia, Cuba, and maybe still by China?
Well, Cuba was a little player, okay, maybe it was just for the image. But the other countries, probably they didn't made it on purpose, but they saw an open door. I mean, that was a fact. There was an open door for them, so an open invitation. And well, they took advantage. Of course, we know that Italy has some populist government, so okay, they were much in favor to accept everything and anything. But in my view, it was an open door, like an open invitation.
And that was because was that because you mentioned, Arlene, the Hanseatic League, as you called it, as a sort of union within the union? Was it because those people have this paradigm of just, community of trade instead of a political community with European solidarity, whatever that exactly may mean? That would actually be very undermining for the unity of the European Union, or is it not that severe? What is your take on that?
I think the underlying problems are very severe. And the Corona crisis has not caused them, but it is highlighting some of the things that we failed to do earlier. One of the things, for example, the very foundation of the European Union was the Lisbon Treaty, which talked about an ever-increasing union, voluntary union of European peoples. And afterwards, it talks about, then that would lead to an increasing political and economic union. And let's just put it like this: that voluntary union of European peoples can have as a result the increasing degree of political and economic union. But up until now, what I think all of us have seen, and that is a serious problem that is actually coming to the fore right now massively, is that we have had the technocratic union of the financial and attempting the political, but there hasn't been a voluntary union of European peoples yet. And my personal opinion on that is that that's probably not going to come. This is ECPM, European Christian Political Movement. And one of the things I take very seriously is Acts chapter 17 in the Bible, verse 26, when it talks about God establishing ethnicities and boundaries of nations. And especially in a time of globalization, people do not identify with a super state, a federal type of concept. People need something more local to identify with. And so we can go into that in a bit more detail. But with regards to your other point, Florian, with regards to Florian also too about Russia and China, was that deliberate? Yes, I'm absolutely convinced that was deliberate. Why? Because you see stories about Russian hospital personnel who don't have enough face masks or protective equipment, and yet Russia is shipping millions of face masks into Europe, for example. That doesn't make sense. In China, essentially, yeah, whether or not you agree with it or not, I think that face mask diplomacy is something that is really going on right now. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it is something that is a fact. But it is something that's a fact. But getting back to it, there are some deeply underlying problems in Europe right now. And I think that we're going to have to look at redefining what we think of as that ever deepening, ever closer voluntary union of European peoples in the very near future.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that's an interesting point that what you make about the voluntary aspect. I can imagine that this maybe also be felt a little bit different among people from several member states. I can imagine that the majority of people from the northern member states would be a little bit afraid because they would say, you know, this is not gonna exactly help us somehow in our, you know, way how we do business and how our economy functions. Whereas from east and south, maybe that would be different, but maybe Florian can say a few words on that. How do you see in Romania European cooperation and this way of European governing?
Yes, well, unfortunately, I mean, I'm seeing at least a lack of solidarity in the EU these days. And it's not just east-west, but it's north-south also, which is a bit surprising. If you ask me specifically about Romania and the eastern countries, I think that we feel a bit left aside on these negotiations, because even that package of 500 billion euros, it's mostly for the Eurozone, which so we feel that we don't belong to this the same as Poland or the other countries. So when we are talking about the Hanseatic countries, the so-called Hanseatic countries, and the countries from the south and the countries from the east, so basically I think in Europe we have now several group of countries who have divergent not necessarily divergent interests, but who are treated different in between themselves. I mean, not necessarily an authority is treating them differently, but at least themselves, they look very cautious one to each other's. Well, I think.
Which groups do you see, Florian?
Well, of course, we have the Nordic countries. I would call them the Protestant countries. Let's say, yes, well, Germany and Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Austria. Well, Austria is not Protestant, but close by. Then you have the countries from the south of Europe, let's say the Mediterranean countries, Italy, Spain, half of France at least, the south of France at least, but Greece, Portugal, okay. And then you have the countries from the Eastern Europe, but here also you have maybe two groups. Maybe you have the Visegrad group, who is a bit more vocal and not so disciplined. We know Hungary or Poland, for instance. And then you have the other countries from Eastern Europe, I don't know, Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania. And even here, you have maybe another group, the small countries from Eastern Europe who are already in the Eurozone. The Baltics, Slovakia, Slovenia, which might be, again, a different group. So I already have five groups in Europe, in EU, which I think it's not helping moving forward this project. It's not helping a lot. So I started to say that we are living exceptional times. So I think we need exceptional measures, but exceptional measures doesn't mean necessarily just pumping money in the economy, but would mean solidarity between the countries and to try to see, okay, maybe we have excedents in the Nordic countries, and those countries from the south or from the east, they have deficits and they are spending and we are saving and so on and so forth. But maybe we have to see we have to add up what everybody is bringing in. I mean, maybe they are good market for us, these countries from the south or from the east. Maybe they are exporting, let's say so, workforce toward us. And I think that we should see the benefits and not just what it's separating each others. And one more thing, I think Europe, at least European Union, never had a good PR, because everybody, when you ask somebody who's the biggest economic power in the world, they would say US, okay. Which is the second? They usually say China. But maybe the second or even the biggest until last year, I mean, before the Brexit, was the EU. I mean, if you calculate all the GDPs from the European countries at the parity purchasing power, all together, including UK, at the time was bigger, I think, even than US. But EU never knew how to do this marketing, to promote themselves this way. Okay, now it's too late because UK, it's already out. But let's hope that we will not have some other exits because of this crisis and frustration due to this.
Okay, thank you. I'm triggered a little bit by the word solidarity, which you mentioned as your key yes. position in this matter. And I would like to ask Arlene a little bit about this, because your center it focuses on economics of mutuality. Well, mutuality, I think, implies some form of solidarity as a grounding principle for your economic thinking. Could you tell us a little bit about what exactly you are doing in your center, how you try to help both businesses and, in more general, the economy? And if this new paradigm of mutuality in economics, if that could help us with building some feelings of solidarity among different peoples in Europe without necessarily having this super state.
Mm-hmm. That would be my pleasure, Jacques. Economics of mutuality, actually, it's a paradigm based on the biblical principle of the Jubilee. And that's found in the Leviticus 25, but that is a paradigm that talks about caring for the whole of society. And so it recognizes 4 types of capital or key relationships. Land is one natural capital, but we're not talking there about only the external things that you can measure, like CO2 emissions, even though they are important. But we're talking about being resource efficient as a nation, but also as a company. We recognize also human capital, which is creating an environment in which individuals are free to develop their talents and to contribute. And that's an important thing, to contribute, because mutuality means reciprocity, and reciprocity is a sharing of the benefits of doing something between two or more parties. Economics mutuality also acknowledges social capital, and that's a key thing for the EU right now. Social capital, those are the things that promote cohesiveness in societies instead of splitting them apart. And social capital can be measured both in business and in societies adequately with just 3 variables these days. Number 1 variable is trust. Not surprisingly, I'm going to deal with each one of these separately with regards to the EU. The second variable is cohesiveness, meaning to what degree does one party lord it over the other. And the last of the 3 variables is the capacity for collective action, the ability to get something done together, set pre-agreed upon goals and work together towards them. And the last is, of course, the financial capital. But with regards to what this may mean for the EU and solidarity, I think right now what we're seeing is there's a tremendous lack of social capital within the European Union. And there are things that have contributed to this. Number 1, I think, is the fact that we are so heavily reliant as a world, but also as a Eurozone, on debt-based financing. Because debt-based financing creates a disconnect between lenders and borrowers. And I think that's what we're seeing very, very much right now. One of the ways that the economic situation is set up within the Eurozone is that we bear each other's debts. The debts are shared across the countries that participate. And for example, Italy right now, they are suffering badly, but pre-corona crisis levels of debt to GDP was 133%. And it's expected that that's going to be more than 150% by the time this corona crisis is over. That's to say, the failure of the Italian economy would have not only catastrophic effects for Italy, but also for France, who pre-corona actually was footing 309 billion euros of the Italian debt. You know, and so that is creating skewed relationships in Europe. If Greece were to default on her debt, you know, it's just because of the European safety measures that are in place, it wouldn't be the governments that are paying for that debt. It would be the taxpayers, the individual taxpayers. And so that debt-based financing and lending and borrowing to cover each other's loans, that's actually creating disconnect and a lack of trust in our relationships. Within the Southern European nations, I can understand that they're feeling that the Hanseatic League just doesn't care, you know, and is just looking at the bottom line. And within the Northern nations, you know, it's just we're looking, and there's a completely different perspective there. It's not fair that certain nations have to foot the bill consistently every time. And so that is skewing things. And I think one of the things that we're going to need to do also relationally in order to help to ease the tension is to start to work towards more equity-based lending and borrowing and move away from that strong debt basing. But that is one of the situations. There's a strong lack of social capital, and that has to do with a lack of trust within the EU. It has to do with the fact that the way that we structured loans is creating borrowers and lenders, or vassal states, some would even say, and that is hurting our relationships throughout the Eurozone.
I see. Well, but somebody might, you know, remark that all the EU member states are, you know, heavily indebted and have seen their state levels of debt rising over the last, well, I don't know, 40 years or so, up to quite heavy, quite high levels. So is it a matter of, so to say, that some are ahead in the curve, or how does it work in your opinion?
Yeah, in my opinion, the system, indeed, the debt levels have raised, but what you do have is that there are some groups of nations that are net contributors, lenders, and there are some groups of nations that are net borrowers from that. But one of the reasons why I said, for example, that I also anticipate a euro crisis coming in after this is because when the Eurozone was set up, there was no, or when the euro was set up, there was no exit mechanism. Already we were starting to see with the crisis in Greece back then, for example, that one of the key ways that nations used to have as a safety valve to relieve the pressure on their economies, weaker nations, was to devalue their currencies. And when the euro came in, we contractually agreed that that was no longer possible for nations within the euro. And so what you saw was that the stronger currencies, Germany, the Netherlands, etc., that their values went down, which increased their export, while the value of the currencies in the southern European nations, I'm not even talking east to west now, went up. The value of the Greek euro increased by almost 50%. The value of the French euro increased by 20%. So what you saw was a flow of capital from Northern Europe to Southern Europe. And so what I'm trying to say there is that there are some things that we're going to need to change structurally in order to start to redress the situation. And I'm going to introduce something very controversial now. And that is, with the Corona crisis, things that were considered impossible before. And that is that we are lending and spending now without limit, simply to keep our societies and our economies afloat and keep them from crashing. Those things are now possible. But we've got now levels of debt that have not ever been seen in economic history. And so I think we're not going to be able to get around the fact that at sometime in the very near future, we're going to have to talk about debt cancellation to a certain degree too. Otherwise, we're going to saddle the next 3 or 4 generations with a debt that they're not even going to be able to pay off. So we're going to have to look at that option also.
Okay, that's interesting to think about a little more. But first, a small question. I mean, you could also argue, if you speak in economic terms, you could also argue and say, you know, the main underlying problem between North and South is that labor productivity in general in South is too low. They do not have enough innovative industries. And one of the structural measures that you could, okay, I agree it's very long term, but that you could do is to try to work on restructuring these economies to have more industries with very high added value, so mainly those high-tech industries. Isn't that at all an option to go into that direction?
That is an option, as you say, for the longer term, but I see it more as and not either or. Because it's just, we're going to have to figure out what to do in the next couple of months that will have an effect for the long term. So I see indeed helping some of those Southern European nations develop those industries. But right now, I see there's also a fundamental need to restructure how we're doing things with regards to debt in the EU.
Okay. That's, well, Florin, you teach these issues on public finance.
That's right.
If we would take this advice of canceling some loans, Can you comment on what would probably be some of the consequences that you would be seeing throughout Europe if we would do that?
Well, let me answer first at your previous question. You were saying that if not all the countries in the Europe actually have debts. Basically, that was your question. I mean, Germany has 80% of the GDP, France has around 80, and so on and so forth. But it's true, But I very much agree with Arlene that it's at the same time it's different. When you have countries from south of Europe, like Italy or Greece, or even more from Eastern Europe who have debts, is not let's say the same debt, the same kind of debt. Because look at Romania, we have a very low debt, which is 35% of the GDP only. Bulgaria the same, I think even less than us, around 30. Estonia even less, okay. But if you look at the cost of this debt, now then it's a different story. We are paying 4% in euros, okay, for our debt, which is a lot of money nowadays when the interest rates are close to zero. I mean, of course, Germany has 80% of their GDP in debt, but it's with negative interest. I mean, they should be full not to take any more debt. I mean, it's free money. They're even paid to have these debts, so it's not fair at all. They did some scenario at the Central Bank of Romania that if our debt is reaching 45% of the GDP, will become unsustainable. We could not afford to pay it, because if we will already have by the end of this year 10% budgetary deficit, we will not able to service a debt which is increasing from 35 to 45% of the GDP. So we might become, we might enter default, even if doesn't look so. So I think we can introduce this concept of that we are talking about different types of debts with different.
Okay, that makes sense.
Even Italy right now, it's paying around 2% interest on their debts, around 2% for their bonds. Okay, and we can look at Greece, which is very close by. And if you look at all these Hanseatic countries, they have negative interest rate on the debt. So I think it's a big issue, the public debt for the countries. And this is due to the fact, I mean, it's because of the fact that we tackle this Corona crisis with the same tools as we tackled 10 years ago, the 2008 crisis. We didn't learn anything. We did the same quantitative easing, you know, we pumped money, we printed money, but where this money are going to? They are going to the banks. And very often they stay in the banks. They don't reach the entrepreneurs, they don't reach, you know, the people who are in need, the countries who are in need, and so on and so forth. And they just contribute to raising these debts. So I really think also that we need to change the paradigm of how we solve the issue of this crisis. We don't have to use the same measures that we take in the 2008, because they proved that they are not efficient on the long term. Okay, they can solve the fire. Okay, we have a fire. We call the firemen. The firemen are coming. They pour water, a lot of water, which is the quantitative easing, and so on. But then what? Then you make a flood of debts, or maybe later on inflation, or both.
Yeah.
So definitely we need anything else to try, and I think Arlene's proposal can be very interesting.
Yeah, that's what I would like to delve a little bit more into in the last couple of minutes that we still have left, because time is really flying. When looking at the future, already some things have been said about it, about the you know, the ways how to overcome the upcoming economic and debt crisis that we can expect in Europe. I would be very glad to hear from Arlene some concrete proposals that you would suggest to decision makers on the European level related to economics and mutuality, and how this can help this new paradigm in solving this new problem, and not to come up with methods from yesterday, which probably, you know, in the long run, as Florine said, make things actually worse.
Yeah. One of the, I can mention a few things. Number one, I think one of the things that Europe has to offer with regards to its richness is the diversity of culture and history. And the current arrangement that we have with how the EU is set up, we don't recognize that enough. And so as a result, one thing that I would propose is an amendment of the Lisbon Treaty to redefine that ever-increasing union more as a confederal structure, and not so much a federal structure. That would give nation states the ability to have more independence. And I'm also thinking of the Southern and Eastern European nations to decide things based on their history and their culture and the needs of their peoples, and that we arrange things at a European level that need to be arranged at European level. For example, cybersecurity or policing, anti-terrorism, etc. Moving on from there, I think that would ease the tension, and it would start to allow people to appreciate what the different regions and groups could offer. Another thing that I think we need to do is, I talked about, you know, future generations, their chances are being seriously limited by the situation now. And I notice that, for example, youth unemployment, if we just look at that, it's been skewed. And youth in the Southern European nations have borne an overly large brunt of the burden of unemployment in the EU. You see that people in Greece, in France, young people, they're leaving their nations to come to the Northern European nations. And so I think it's highly important when we talk about relationships and also mutuality, that the next generation is considered an important stakeholder in any discussions about how to proceed further with the EU. Debt-free growth, I think, is a must right now. And so I would say, you know, we need increased financial transparency to increase trust between electorates and their national governments. I think we need to remove the tax advantages that there currently exists for debt-based finance. And why do I say that? Yes, because I know that the world is doing it, but debt-based finance makes you more susceptible in times of crisis and economic downturn. So we have to start to reduce that. I don't say eliminate it, but certainly reduce it. Another thing that I propose is defining the single market, create a new single market within the EU. It's within our power to do that, of 3 freedoms, and that's to trade goods, services, and capital. It's a nice idea to have a political union, but we are not there by a long shot right now. And so start to create things that the nation states can all say yes to, and work with what we can work with in common, and then start to move out from there. And I would just also say too, corporations are an important part of generating finances in any nations. A typical multinational can function in 30 plus nations at one time. No single national government is able to do that. And so I think things like making them more mutual. And that's what our whole center is about, in how they, we talk about a single integrated mutual bottom line, where what we're proving is actually the corporations that put people, the well-being of people, society, and environment ahead of just pure profit maximization, what we're finding is they perform better than corporations that just prioritize profit maximization. And so as a result, there are some moves on the way, certainly in my nation and in a number of other nations, to actually require business to be part of the solution in the future too.
Okay. Yes, I believe that we certainly need business involved, because that's the real generators of the added value in our society. So we need to have them involved in as a stakeholder.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you also put youth there. I find it a very good idea. Just what kind of measures could that be? I mean, are you talking then about free education, free movement of students throughout European universities, more than we have already, or what kind of measures are you thinking about?
I think that what we're seeing right now is, let's just say, I wouldn't call it free education, but I would call it more affordable education.
Okay.
For the next generation. And why am I saying that? Is because one of the factors that we haven't discussed yet is that our economic systems are resetting, and they are not going back to how they were before. We are also right in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, where the World Economic Forum calculates that by 2035, 47% of the jobs that currently exist will no longer exist. And that's massive, coming on top of Corona. And so as a result, with regards to the next generation, I think the European Parliament, they should be represented there, a political voice. I also think too, with regards to the young as stakeholders, we need to start to train them in how to think creatively and how to think entrepreneurially. And when I say entrepreneurially, I mean not everybody is a business person, but how to take initiative, how to think outside of the box. Those kind of creative thinking skills are going to be required for any kind of post-Corona society and economy that we come into.
I see. So yeah, we are very much nearing the end of our conversation. Maybe some words from you, Florin, about what do you think as good measures for the long term to get out of this crisis, maybe specifically thought from an Eastern or Central Eastern European perspective? What would you need?
Well, indeed, I think we need to see clear sign of support that we are in and we are not let outside. Because actually was the best thing that happened for Romania in the centuries is to be member of the European Union. That's a fact. I mean, we are very happy with this, but at this moment somehow we feel that some other things are important that at the core of the EU. So not necessarily we need I don't know, money or things like that, but just clear messages that EU at least is staying together. Because for the rest, I think indeed what Arlene was mentioning can work also here. Education, youth entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, all these kind of things will move, because the young people, they have access to this, but indeed education should be free or at least very affordable. But you know, at least Jacques knows very well that we have serious problems in the rural area with the access to education, and especially now with the online education, many of these kids, they cannot afford even, you know, these tools like a tablet or a phone or something like that, which is quite an issue. We are talking about 10, 20%, I don't know, even more of the kids. The numbers are not very clear. So education is the key to create entrepreneurs who are not necessarily just entrepreneurs in the business area, but they can be entrepreneurs in the NGOs. They can be entrepreneurs in I don't know, for some project, cultural project. They can be any type of project that can bring value added. And once again, I think that exchanging students, you know, and programs like Erasmus is probably one of the best things that EU has ever done. Because if you want to create a united Europe and you want to create a European citizen, let's say so, those people, those young people, they need to travel. And I'm very optimistic that this will happen if the program keeps running as what was running till now. And you will have the new generation probably building, and I have big hopes from them, and I'm quite optimistic from this point of view.
Thank you. Yes, I have to say from my own experience, I like very much the Erasmus program very much as well. It gives a very good opportunity for people to get to know each other and to break stereotypes between different countries. This is something we really, really need. And just to sum up or to conclude our conversation, it seems like we really have agreement between the two of you that something needs to change in the way that we are organizing our economy, the way that we work on supporting different countries, different economies, and that we really need to think about what we can do different, because the ways that we did from the past will not work in the future with all the innovations and developments that we have. Therefore, yes, there is no more that we can talk about in the limited time that we have, just 1 hour. But I am absolutely grateful that at least we had this nice insight in the new paradigm of economics of mutuality. Thank you very much, Dr. Westerhoff. Thank you very much, Dr. Duma, for your presentations and suggestions and things related to Eastern Europe. It was really good to hear also this perspective, because we hear that not so often. That's really north-south nowadays, but there is other parts of Europe as well. So thank you for your contribution in this matter as well. And last but not least, I would like to thank the support staff of ECPM for making this conversation possible. During this time of lockdown and crisis, it is a perfect moment to reflect on what we are doing, where we are going, and so on and so forth. Crisis, the Greek word, is not just means a problem, but also like a restart, a new beginning. And I sincerely hope that in the way that how we organize our economy together, we can use this period of time during the Corona crisis as a very new start of treating each other and working with each other in our lives. With these words, I would like to thank all of you for listening, for speaking, and for discussing about this subject. And I'm sure that it's possible to put some questions or comments under the video once it's posted on Facebook, and we can, see what we can do with that. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.